Yeah, saturation diving itself is really it's just a method of diving very, very deep. It's deep sea diving, basically. But diving deep is quite a difficult thing to do. There are sort of physiological limitations to diving to deep. The first ones surround the gas that you breathe. So if you were to breathe air, just air as we're breathing now, diving very deep, the levels of oxygen in that would cause convulsions and things because of the pressures involved. The nitrogen in the gas that you breathe also is sort of has a narcotic effect when you stay down there for a long time, and you can have a really drunken sensation and become disorientated and make very poor decisions and things like that. But the biggest problem with diving deep is the decompression involved. So most people know when you're diving, on your scuba diving, for example, um, you pay a penalty being down there in terms of the inert gases that you absorb. So if you're breathing air, then that inert gas is nitrogen, and you absorb that into your system. The deeper you go, the longer you spend down there, the more of that nitrogen you absorb into your tissues, basically. And if you're to ascend directly to the surface, having been down there for, say, half an hour, 30 meters, those tissues, that gas would expand and expand too rapidly and rupture tissues, block arteries, block veins, and arrest the flow of oxygen to the brain ultimately. And that causes what we call the bends, or decompression sickness, more officially. So to avoid that when you're scuba diving, as most people probably know, you would take stops on the way back up. You might stop 3 meters below the surface and spend 10 minutes allowing those gases to pass more naturally out of your system in a more controlled fashion, the bubbles to expand more slowly, and you can ascend to the surface slowly. The problem's when you're diving very, very deep. So in commercial diving, in a commercial environment where I've worked most of my life, you can regularly dive down to 100 or 200 meters. But if you go down to 100 meters and spend 6 hours a day down there, which is what we do, that equivalent decompression, so those stops on the way back to the surface, would take 4 days. So obviously that isn't feasible on a day-to-day basis. You can't ask a human being to hang on a rope for 4 days. They're going to get hungry and thirsty, obviously. And, and also from a commercial perspective, we can't do no work for 4 days at a time. So that's the most significant problem really with diving very, very deep, is the time involved. And on day one of any sort of project, you would go in as a team. There's usually 12 of us, 4 teams of 3. The door is closed behind you, and those pods, if you like, the steel tubes, are pressurized down to an equivalent working depth. So you pump in that helium oxygen mixture that I've just talked about to pressurize the system down. If you're going to be diving at 100 meters, we might pressurize the system to about 90 meters. It's a process that takes about an hour or two just to do in a nice controlled fashion, basically. And once you're there under pressure, you live in that environment. So in the UK, for example, we're limited to 28 days at a time living in that chamber, but that's where you will live for a full month, basically, under pressure all of the time, eating, sleeping, reading, doing whatever you do day to day in the confines of those chambers. And then every day a diving bell locks onto the top of those chambers, and as a team of 3, you climb up into it. The pressure is isolated between the diving bell and the chamber system, and then the diving bell is lifted, sort of trolleyed across, and then dropped through a hole in the bottom of the boat, a moon pool we call that, and lowered down to that equivalent working depth. So lowered down to 90 meters in this example. And when you get there, you open the door at the bottom of the diving bell, and because you have an equivalence of pressure inside and out, the water doesn't come in. So you have a dry environment from which to dive. You put on a big old diving helmet, drop down to the seabed. You will spend 6 hours working there doing whatever we do, and then you'll come back to the diving bell, close the door, you're hoisted back up to the ship, locked back onto the chamber. The pressure is equalized between the two, and you sort of drop back down into the chamber system on the boat, have a shower, have something to eat, go to sleep, and then you get up the next day and do the same thing. You go diving again, and you do that day after day after day for 24 days in this example. And then after 24 days, you stop diving, and you basically lie in your bunk with a book for 4 days, that 4 days of decompression that I was talking about, as that gas pressure is bled out very, very slowly at a rate of about 1 meter per hour, which is why it takes about 4 days. Yeah, when you sort of reach surface pressure, basically, you come back to zero. The door will pop open, you get out, you go home for a month, and you come back and do the same thing. And so what you're really doing, and what saturation diving really is saturating your tissues with inert gas. So you don't have to do any more decompression than those 4 days. And you're basically doing one long dive, really, a dive that takes 28 days. So you're under pressure the whole time. We were working, when I say we, there were three of us in the water that day. One of the team of three always stays in the diving bell every day, and two of us get in the water. It's a position we rotate. But yeah, that day it was myself and my colleague Dave Yuasa. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and we were just removing a section of pipeline, really. The kind of thing we do day in, day out. We were doing some pressure testing. We had a big hose which was coming down from the ship, sort of dropping the 100 or so meters down to us, and we were isolating pressure either side of this section of pipeline. Then suddenly we heard some alarms, which is not an unusual thing. As divers, you have a sort of an earpiece and a microphone in your helmet, so we have an open line of communication up to a dive supervisor on the ship, and he really told us in no uncertain terms quite quickly that we needed to get ourselves out of the structure we were working inside and back to the diving bell. He didn't really explain what was happening. I don't think he particularly needed to, but you could just tell from the tone of his voice that it wasn't a drill, it wasn't something normal. But it wasn't panic-inducing at that point. In order to be able to work on the seabed, because we are attached as divers to the diving bell and therefore to the ship, by what we call an umbilical, and that is exactly what it sounds like. It's a giver of life, really. It provides us with an infinite supply of breathing gas, essentially, that comes from the ship. It provides you with hot water to keep you warm in what are obviously very or close to freezing conditions down on the bottom. Because we're tethered to the bell and the ship, it's essential that the ship remain in one position while we're diving. We also need it to do that for practical purposes. We're using cranes all the times and things like that, so we can't have the ship just moving around. And so it's a great system when it works, which is what we're coming to. So they'd suffer basically what we call a single point failure, which wasn't supposed to be possible. It has multiple backups, this computer system, as do all of our life support systems. And it suffered this catastrophic failure of that. And very quickly, the boat had become a sailboat, really, at the mercy of that 35 knot wind and the waves, and was just starting to move quite rapidly, really, away from the position we were working in. And that means that it's starting to drag us. Because we're tethered to it, basically. Dave and I made a pretty orderly exit from the structure, though. It was quite often there were lots of things to get caught on. That day it was actually quite open, and we sort of made our way out of it fairly quickly. I would say within 20 seconds we were outside of the structure, which is the biggest danger, really, is getting caught in there if the vessel moves away. As a scuba diver, you might bolt to the surface if you've got a problem, which is never a good idea because of for the reasons I've already described. But as a saturation diver, if you were to go straight to the surface, you would die basically instantly from explosive decompression. All those gases would just expand very rapidly and rupture your tissues and kill you straight away. So there is only one safe haven, and that safe haven is the diving bell. It's the only breathable environment down there as well. It's quite easy to find because it's at the end of your umbilical, thankfully, so you can't really get lost, although I've known plenty of divers who've got close to it. So in any situation like that, we just follow our umbilicals, and our umbilicals, instead of running out in front of us where we'd left them, were actually wrapped over the back of our heads and back over the top of the structure we'd been working inside. So we turned to start climbing those umbilicals. That sort of takes two hands. You're climbing hand over hand. When I get to the top, as I said, we're always conscious of that umbilical. I turn to make sure it doesn't catch on anything, basically. And that's when I realized very, very quickly that I was in serious trouble, because it had looped around, it was just a transponder bucket, but basically a metal outcrop on the side of this structure. And I turned to free it or make sure it didn't catch, but it was so incredibly quick that, I realized I had no chance. It tightened, a little loop of it tightened around about a 1-inch gap. And what had happened in this situation, basically, is I'd become an anchor to a 10,000-ton vessel, and there's obviously only ever going to be one winner in that situation. My initial concern, though, wasn't really that. It was the fact that umbilical, it was going through this little 1-inch gap, but it was slipping. So it was pulling me down actually into the structure, and my legs were splaying quite violently. And I remember thinking, my legs are going to break here. That's going to be painful. And secondly, if it continues to slip, I'm going to be pulled through that 1 inch gap, and there'll be no stopping that. Like being pulled through a cheese grater, that wasn't going to be a very pleasant way to go either. Um, Thankfully, I guess, and ironically, really, the umbilical stopped slipping, and sort of held tight. So I wasn't pulled through the gap, thankfully, but that did mean that massive tension started to come onto my umbilical. I should say it's only 50 meters long, so there's only so much slack they can give me, and it tightened to the point where they couldn't give me slack anyway. But yeah, as the vessel was continuing to move away in this uncontrolled fashion, and massive tension starts to come onto that. Initially, I think the power cable or the communications cable inside that umbilical, it's like a bundle that's a couple of inches thick, perhaps. I think they must have stretched and snapped. I was begging them to give me a bit of extra slack, not as politely as that, to be honest, but and they were just telling me, or Craig was telling me, to get back to the diving bell, and like a jack being pulled out the back of a speaker. Very suddenly, I had there was silence. I couldn't hear them; they couldn't hear me. Which, even amongst all the panic of that situation, because being no doubt I was panicking, that was a very lonely thing to happen. Suddenly you're in what feels like a very lonely place at the best of times. Down there, it's dark and ethereal and an alien sort of place. And to suddenly have no one to speak to is a bit disconcerting, even in that situation. Very quickly after that, though, it got a bit worse in that the gas hose, I think, which provides you with this infinite supply of gas, as I've described, I think it must have got kinked inside, and quite abruptly I had nothing to breathe, which is, it's never good, is it? And we have a knob on the side of our diving helmets, which, and trust me, in that situation, when you've got nothing to breathe, you open it quite quickly, but it opens a flow of gas from some emergency tanks that we carry on our back. So at that time, it was just a couple of big scuba bottles, really. Because of the depth, 2 big scuba bottles in that situation, I mean, we'll never really know how long they lasted, but if you do the maths, it's something like 8 or 9 minutes of breathing gas. Not very long in an emergency situation to get yourself back to a breathable environment. So I'm on a clock straight away. As soon as I've opened that valve, I'm on a clock. The tension continues to come on the umbilical. My colleague Dave, who's in the water with me, he realizes there's a problem. He turns to try and help me. We couldn't speak to each other at that point because my communication cable had been severed. And we had a bit of an eyeball to eyeball moment, really. It was it felt like a movie, really, at the time. We're sort of staring into each other's eyes, and I'm looking at him, sort of entreating him to give me a hand, and he was basically looking at me saying, I can do nothing, because he was being pulled away himself. He got to within a couple of meters away, and then he was dragged backwards by the boat. And I remember losing sight of him, but I could still see his light. And then I lost sight of his light as well, and he was gone in the darkness, and I basically never saw him again. He was dragged off the top of the structure in no small amount of danger himself, unable to do anything to help me, so he has to just help himself and drag himself back to the diving bell in very, very difficult conditions. He told me he was absolutely exhausted by the time he did get back there. But just before he got dragged away, he was sort of being pulled back alongside my umbilical, which is creaking and groaning and straining under the massive tension it was under. And then very abruptly, like a shotgun going off, it snaps. But that meant that the tension was relieved on me, if you like, and I fell backwards from the top of the structure. I fell the 10 meters back down to the seabed and landed on my back, like a bit of an upturned turtle. And yeah, it was. I remember almost pausing for a second in disbelief. Really, it was strange. Hadn't really worked out, I don't think, what was going on. I also remember the incredible darkness, like a darkness I've never known before or since. Really, I literally couldn't see the shadow of my hand in front of my face, which is very disorientating. Obviously, it's a sort of disorientating, confusing place to be at the best of times, even with a light and a compass and somebody telling you where to go. But even at that point, I don't think I was thinking very much about what was going on. You are just thinking, I need to get myself back to that diving bell, to that breathable environment before I run out of gas. And so I sort of got myself to my feet in a pretty ungainly fashion. We wear a pair of, I think people always imagine us just finning gracefully about, but we wear a pair of yellow, cheap fisherman's wellies, and we're wandering around on the seabed all the time wearing all kinds of cumbersome equipment. But I didn't know, I felt I needed to go upwards. I needed to get to the top of the structure again, mostly to be able to see where the diving bell was, or to make it easier for people to find me as well. But I had no idea where that was. It was an enormous thing and painted bright yellow, but in that darkness, I couldn't see it at all. So a bit like setting off, to the toilet in the middle of the night. I put my hands out in front of me and set out in hope more than expectation, I think. And yeah, I mean, we suffered this terrible dose of bad luck, if you want to call it that. And then subsequently, because obviously I am sat here, a lot of good luck. And one of those doses of good luck was, I took a couple of steps and bumped straight into what I assumed was the structure. I wasn't really sure even then, but something big and felt metallic. I could very easily have turned and gone the other way, very, very easily, and ended up in no man's land and lost on the seabed, I guess, and which would have rendered finding me and therefore rescuing me infinitely more difficult. But yeah, I did find it, and I remember being scared that I would lose it, so I sort of edged my way along it and tried to find a way to climb up. Eventually, I found a hose that had enough purchase that I was able to get myself back to the top, and that was a bit of a seminal moment, really. That I looked up at that point, for some reason, fully expecting to see the diving bell there above me somewhere, lit up. Dave on his way back to get me. It was all going to be fine, like it always is. And there was nothing. There was not a speck of light in the sea above me. Nothing but the most complete darkness. And that's the point, I think, really, where certainly in my mind it transitioned from being a bit of a fright, a bit of a panic, into what was clearly going to be a life or death situation, or certainly, threatened to be that.
Hi, and welcome to Deep.
We love making videos, meeting people and letting them tell their stories.
We really hope you're enjoying the channel, and if you are and would like a bit more,
We've just launched the series as a podcast on Spotify.
It's the full interviews uncut, so you can hear the whole thing, wherever you are, at home or on the go.
But no matter where you're watching the content, please remember to like, comment and subscribe, as it really helps the channel.
And don't forget to drop a comment below and tell us who you'd like us to talk to next.
Thank you. Now, back to our story.
Okay, cool.
I also realised quite quickly that I was powerless to do anything to help myself. I was worried about being blown off the top of the structure by the current, as I sort of crawled in the darkness across the top of this thing, and tried to position myself in the middle, clinging on really, craning my neck upwards. But I had no buoyancy. There was no way for me to swim upwards. We were sort of negatively buoyant. There was nothing to swim to anyway. I couldn't see where they were. I had no idea. I'd been panicking, though. I'll never pretend that I wasn't scared and frightened and panicking till that point, breathing hard. My maths isn't great at the best of times, but I remember doing the maths roughly and thinking, I have probably only got about 8 or 9 minutes gas in this tank on my back. I've already used surely 4 or 5 minutes of that, breathing hard, panicking, getting myself back up to the top. And even if Dave had been right there in front of me, ready to help me back, to haul me back up to that diving bell, the margin between getting back into that breathable environment before my gas ran out was already very, very slim or very fine. So with nobody there, it sort of dawned on me quite quickly that I probably wasn't going to get out of this. And this was likely to be the place I was going to die. Strangely, though, that had a calming effect. I think at that point, when I realised I was helpless, the fear, the panic drained out of me, really. I can almost remember it washing out of me, and I was definitely trying to calm my breathing just to conserve the gas that I did have left. But it almost happened automatically. Your body sort of almost closed down. I would also at that point have been getting hypothermically cold very, very quickly. I don't really have a memory of that, strangely. I sort of all the feelings of panic went away and were overtaken. I was just overcome, I think, by grief, really, is probably the best way to explain it. I don't like to labour it too much because I'm very conscious that I don't want to be a charlatan. I'm sat here, I nearly said well and healthy and well anyway. But your thoughts do absolutely turn to everybody at home and the enormous. I remember thinking about the enormous damage my death was going to cause, the chaos that's going to bring to everybody else's life, everybody you're lucky enough to have love you, I guess. And I was sort of I remember thinking about my parents being told of the unnatural order of their son dying before them. And I was in my early 30s at the time. An exciting period of life, I guess. I was in the process of building my own house at the time. I was getting married the following year. That didn't work out, so I shouldn't have worried so much. But yeah, a life ahead of you, dreams of children, dreams of traveling, all the wonderful things that life can bring us. And it feels as though not just that they're about to be snatched away from you and taken away from you, but taken away from you in this really alien, unusual place. I grew up in a middle class family in Cambridge, and I remember thinking, how have I ended up here? How's this happened? I really should have worked harder at school. It seemed almost incredible, really, that this was where it was all going to end in this fashion. And that was right up until I did run out of gas. That sort of part actually wasn't particularly traumatic. Again, I feel like a charlatan. I get contacted quite a lot these days by people who've lost loved ones, and they, asking what is it like to die almost. And I quite obviously, don't have the right to tell anybody. But I suppose the crumb of comfort I can offer people, and which I offer myself absolutely, is that process wasn't that bad that night. It was I can remember it taking longer than I thought, definitely. And then eventually, I think when you start to run out of gas in a scuba tank, you can feel it because it gets a bit harder to breathe it down, a bit harder to suck it, basically. And so I realized that was going to be the end. And I remember thinking, I hope this doesn't hurt. I really hope my hat doesn't fill with water and I drown. I had that crossed my mind for some reason. I really didn't want to drown. But the very last moments, I describe it like you going to sleep last night, thinking about tomorrow, how excited you were for the podcast. But that very final moment where you sort of pass basically into unconsciousness, you don't really remember that. And that's very much what it was like for me. I think the carbon dioxide must have built up in my helmet and pretty much put me out quite gently, really. So yeah, what I tell people and what I tell myself is if that's what it's like when my time does come for real, which obviously it will, I can live with that. It was okay. It wasn't too traumatic. I've never been someone who fears death, but I think like a lot of people, I fear the process of death and how my death happens. And if it's anything like that or going in my sleep, then it's okay, Basically, my part in the story is kind of over then, really. I'm the damsel in distress, if you like. From then on, I'm just lying unconscious on the top of this structure. The ship was nearly 250 meters away from me. They were battling to regain control of it. They were ultimately, they weren't able to do that for a long period of time. Terribly traumatic for those on board. Yeah, for them it was much more difficult. I think many have suffered sleepless nights and left the industry, left diving, that kind of thing, because whilst they were struggling to get control of the vessel, Dave can't get anywhere near me. He hasn't got enough umbilical. But what they were able to send over to me is what we call a remotely operated vehicle. So that's just a flying camera, really, has a manipulator arm on it as well. But it has a really long tether. So they were able to eventually sort of guess where I was, or they got a couple of pings off a beacon I was wearing as well. So they were able to fly this thing over to me, which means they have everything on camera because I have a camera on my helmet. And then this quite harrowing footage, really, of it, this sort of flying camera coming in and finding my at that point just twitching body. So they come across me, and in a sort of black and white footage is quite remarkable, really. Even I feel disassociated from it, but it is quite strange to see. My body sort of twitching, my hands are moving in this unnatural fashion. So that gets back to me, and it sits there and watches me because there's nothing anybody can do to help me at that point. They're struggling until they have regained control of the boat. They can't help me, basically. And it sits there for 40 minutes, basically, and watches me twitching, and then it watches me stop twitching. And then for sort of 30 odd minutes, I'm lying there completely motionless, and everybody watching this on screen. So it's very difficult for them. Would have had profound professional implications, but also personal implications. That would have weighed heavily, I suspect, on everybody involved to lesser or greater extent. For everybody involved that night. They do regain control of the vessel. By the time they do get over the top of me, I think 35 minutes have passed then since I've run out of breathing gas. Dave is then able to drop down from the bell, come and find me. That again is all on camera. You can see him coming in and he gave me a little bit of a breathing supply. Then he hooks himself onto me and drags me back up to the diving bell, which was a genuinely superhuman effort. He didn't have any buoyancy because that hose he'd given me was his source of buoyancy. I might not be able to tell on camera, but I'm about 6'5". I weighed quite a bit more back then as well. You've got a lot of heavy equipment on. The bell itself is moving up and down 5 or 6 meters because of the swell of the waves above. Very, very, very hard thing to do to pull me back. He's a really fit guy. He has a sort of rock climber's physique almost, quite lithe, but really fit. I tell you right now, a lot of people would not have managed that in massively pressurized conditions. I mean, in fairness to him, he very much thought he was bringing the dead body back. They all did, really. They might suggest otherwise. They were all hoping, I'm sure, but it didn't look credible. I certainly didn't look alive. And he did. He managed it. Something obviously I can never thank him enough for. And he can then feed me into the diving bell through the sort of the hole in the bottom, and I block the passageway then, so he can do no more. He sort of lay exhausted, I think, on the underneath. He said to me, if he hadn't got me over the lip underneath the diving bell on the last effort, he was spent, shattered. He would have had to drop me basically, and they'd have had to find another way. So yeah, very close again. But yeah, once I'm inside, Duncan can then take my helmet off. I'm sort of hooked onto a rescue lanyard basically in the diving bell, just my head and shoulders above the water. And he takes my helmet off and he says that I was bright blue. Whether that was through the cold or through cyanosis or hypoxia, we're not really sure. And my head, as you can see, is quite bald, and he was really struggling to keep my head up. He says my head was sort of lolling down into the water, and he was trying to get my equipment off and trying to get to me. And he said it was like, he describes it as holding an 8 ball, having to try and keep my head upright. And then he gave me two breaths, really, the kiss of life, basically. And apparently I just exhaled very, very violently, like a violent exhalation, and came around straight away. I don't remember that. I don't remember being conscious particularly. Apparently I was just grunting, and he was asking me questions, and I was I was unresponsive really, but I was breathing. And then I begin to recover fairly quickly, and after 3 or 4 minutes, I'm able to climb up the ladder into the diving bell myself, and sit down on my chair. There's a little stool I sort of sit on, and apparently I started to take my equipment off like nothing had happened. Still to this day, it seems incredible, really. Dave is then able to get back into the diving bell as well. So he gets in. He sits down, that we sort of they close the door of the bell, and we begin the process of bringing us up to the ship. That's a process that takes about half an hour to get us all the way back up and locked back onto the diving system and equalize the pressure. During which time they're heating me up. They're trying to they run hot water through my suit, just try and warm me gently, because obviously I was very, very cold, very, very low body temperature at that point. I don't really remember any of that. I'm sort of flashing lights a little bit and things like that. I think at some point I reach over and I grab their hands and give them a squeeze. I must have known something had happened. I can remember seeing Dave as well, crumpled, exhausted on the other side of the bell, looking a bit grey, and thinking, what's wrong with him? What's he been through? Remarkable, really. And we get back to the chamber system. I'm able to sort of be lowered and climb back down into the chambers, and then there's a gaggle of divers waiting for me. The other 9, I think it was. We call them a whinge of divers. That's the collective noun for diving. They strip all my clothes off. They sort of shower me with hot water. We have a shower down there, so they're sort of showering me with hot water. None of that made the documentary, thankfully. Nobody needs to see that. But ultimately, I was fine. That's the thing. They wrapped me in blankets. They were very gentle and caring, and sort of carried me through to a bunk. And yeah, they thought I was showing some signs of shock. So we have to be fairly medically self-sufficient in there, because it's very hard to get a doctor into us. So we all have a limited amount of training, I would say, just enough to make you dangerous. They decided they wanted to put an IV line into me. So they had a go. They failed. They decided I didn't need an IV line after all at that point. And then but I mean, I had a bit of bruising, but really I was okay. I was sleepy, vomited a little bit, but within a couple of hours, back to normal, strangely, which I don't like the word miracle particularly. I think there are explanations, but it does seem miraculous. I've been lucky enough to go to speak at the British Medical Society and lots of hyperbaric conferences who are experts and that kind of thing. I was in Florida last week at a perfusionist conference who are people who study blood gas, and they sort of in charge of the oxygenating the blood during open heart surgery and things like that. All people who know loads and loads about this kind of stuff. And I always thought I would get an answer from them. And there are theories, which I'll tell you in a second, but what is definitely true is they find it as incredible as I do, and as I think most people do. Not just that I survived, but that at least no one's been brave enough to say otherwise, that I survived without any brain damage, because that would be the first thing to go. So I think it was two things. I'd always assumed it was the cold. You hear stories of kids particularly falling through ice in Scandinavia, in North America, places like that. You hear tales of young children falling through ice and surviving for long periods of time with nothing to breathe. What I've learned since, though, is that as perfusionists do during open heart surgery, they'll cool the blood, they'll cool the body very rapidly to sort of put it into stasis and hibernation almost. But if that had been the case with me, to go to that level of hypothermia, there's no way I would have been resuscitated that quickly. It's a slow process to bring a human being back to consciousness when their body's that cold. It wouldn't happen with a breath like it was with me. So I think that was probably a factor. It probably extended my period of survival by slowing everything down. I'm sure my heart rate was probably almost non-existent, but still there. Similarly, was I still breathing? I don't really know. But if I was, it would have been very, very slowly because of the cold. But I think what really saved me was the gas that I was breathing. So that's why I bored you with that a little bit at the beginning. But it's those levels of oxygen that we're talking about. So I was breathing 6% oxygen that night. I had 10% oxygen in the emergency tanks on my back, which is almost 5 times as much oxygen as you and I are breathing now. And that would have saturated my tissues, I think, with oxygen. Just given the building blocks of life, the cells, enough oxygenation to be able to survive for that period of time. I probably had a lung full of oxygen as well, or, high PPO2, we call it high partial pressure oxygen, with the last breath. But that would have been full of carbon dioxide, because when you run out of gas, your helmet will fill with CO2, and I would have been breathing that back down. That in itself might have been protective. I understand that would have kind of poisoned my blood, that CO2, and hypercapnic poisoning apparently is neurologically protective. So that again might explain how my brain was protected, if you like. I don't know though. I mean, these are just theories. They I'm quite sure played a part. What is pretty certain is the margins would have been extremely fine. There were so many little things that went my way. Had I been back in the bed a minute later, all sorts of little things, I could very easily not have been here. Yeah.
Did you go back to work?
We did, yeah. We were closed down for 3 weeks by the health and safety executive in the UK for obvious reasons, while they investigated the root cause. But yes, we were given the option to go back. When I say we, I mean the 3 of us in the water that day, and we took it. So we were actually the first people back in the water 3 weeks later. And that's not for any bravery. It was just, as mentioned earlier on, I feel disassociated from what happened in many ways. I watch the footage and I wonder if I'm going to make it the same as anybody else, really. It almost gave us more confidence about what we were doing. They had managed to extricate me from this seemingly impossible situation, and that almost gave us more belief in what we were doing. I don't know if I'd make that decision today. I mean, I'm 13 years older and a bit wiser and more mature, I hope, and more sensitive to people at home as well, I think. I've got 2 kids now as well, and I'm sure that would be a factor, and I'm more easily frightened as happens as you get older. And I was maybe a bit selfish in that decision as well, yeah.
Did you go back to exactly the same place?
We did, yeah, literally to the same place, back to the Hunt in the Manifold, yeah. And the first job was to remove the offending, metal outcrop, really, to make sure it couldn't happen again.
How did that feel?
Yes, slightly surreal, but it was fine. Yeah, it was strange. I mean, there was a lot of laughing and joking, and there were, people taking the mickey out of me as how we deal with these things, isn't it? Especially in the UK. But yeah, I think when we got down there and sort of back to concentrating on what we were doing, it was very quickly forgotten, to be honest. Yeah. When they made the documentary, which was back in 2019, it's called Last Breath, as is the movie. They don't seem to have much imagination. It was amazing to think that we're going to make that. That seemed extraordinary. I was sort of worried that the incident wouldn't have enough material in it, if you like, because it's all over in an hour, sort of thing. Would that be enough for a full documentary? But what they do is, I guess, is explain the world that we work in and show it all. And you've also got all the visual material, which is why it was a bit of a dream for the documentary makers, because they had all the original footage. You've got all the protagonists willing to speak and all survived as well, to tell their story. So that was extraordinary, really, and a great privilege, I guess. I think we were just concerned that we were portrayed fairly and professionally and things like that, and they did a really sensitive job of that. So, and then to then hear, maybe 2 or 3 years later, but they were planning on making a Hollywood version, basically, and then we heard Woody Harrelson had signed up to play Duncan, and I was subsequently played by Finn Cole of Peaky Blinders fame. So, yeah, it was just a great. That was just good fun, really. We were less sensitive about that, I think, because although it uses our names and follows the story fairly closely, it is sort of partially fictionalized, so you feel maybe less sensitive to it. So that was just a lovely experience, and they were really good with us. They sort of involved us a little bit, just to give a dog a bone, sort of thing. But yeah, it's been a really nice experience. Yeah. People always assume you've had an epiphany, which I haven't. I don't think it's changed who I am, really. I don't think so. Others might say otherwise, but there's no doubt it's changed my life, because it has dominated my life ever since. It's a story that has never left me alone. There isn't a day goes by when I don't get I'm not involved with it in some way, or at the very least I'll get a message from somebody in the world who's watched one of the films, or wants to offer me an explanation and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's funny. I think people always think, are you going to get up every morning thinking, I've got as you say, a second chance at life and stuff. But I've met lots of people who've been through similar sort of experiences, life-threatening experiences, and they all seem to say the same thing, which is that life takes over very quickly. You have a brief period where you think, how wonderfully lucky I am. I must, get up and go for a run this morning and enjoy the fresh air. But quickly you've got to go and buy a pint of milk, or there's some trivial trauma in your life that you promised yourself, you're going to be better than from now on, and life takes over again, and you're back to where you were. So yeah, it's been life-changing, but it's, it hasn't really changed me, I don't think. Life doesn't really let you do that. I think I maybe have a more acute awareness of death, perhaps now. I think about death and the fragility of life and the finality of or finite nature of our existence here on Earth, I guess. But I'm sure we all do, don't we, to some extent? Think about the day we're going to die, and when that will come, and it all seems to pass by so quickly, doesn't it? Especially when you get to middle age like me, it seems to be flying by. So yeah, maybe a little bit more of an acute awareness of that, but beyond that, no, life just goes on, really.